in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Warner Robins, Georgia. Few could have imagined the horror that would unfold behind the doors of 202 Wake Forest Drive. To the neighbors, Lucille Ann McManus and her husband, Brian McManus, seemed like an ordinary couple. She, a lifelong Georgia resident, and he, a former police officer from the UK who had settled in the United States years before. But their marriage, investigators would later reveal, was not built on love. Instead, it was tangled in secrets, paperwork, and a desperate attempt at immigration fraud. And when Lucille threatened to unravel it all, the situation spiraled into violence. When officers entered the McManus home that morning, they were met with a scene far different from the story Brian had calmly told dispatchers. There was no firearm, no evidence of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Instead, Lucille bore the marks of a savage beating. Investigators noted multiple blunt force injuries inconsistent with any kind of suicide. Brian's story began to fall apart immediately. His demeanor was strangely controlled, even rehearsed. He insisted he had simply gone out for a routine walk with his dog, only to return and find his wife dead. But detectives knew what they were looking at. This was no tragic accident. This was a staged crime scene. As the investigation unfolded, disturbing truths began to surface. According to prosecutors, Brian McManus had married Lucille in what was essentially a sham marriage. For years, the arrangement had allowed him to maintain legal residency in the United States. But Lucille, at 63, was growing tired of the deception. She had allegedly threatened to expose the fraud, a move that would have left Brian facing not only deportation, but also criminal charges. The motive became clear: silence Lucille before she could go to authorities. Detectives quickly zeroed in on inconsistencies in Brian's story. His timeline didn't match up. His calm behavior in the face of such a brutal discovery raised red flags. And then came the forensic evidence. Lucille's injuries pointed to a violent struggle, and investigators were certain that her killer was not some unknown intruder, but the man who had called 911. By the end of that very same day, November 24, 2023, Brian McManus was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. When the case went to court, prosecutors painted a chilling picture. They described Brian as a manipulative man who exploited a woman for his own gain, and when she finally threatened to expose him, he turned to violence. His background as a former police officer made the betrayal even more disturbing. A man who once swore to uphold the law, now standing accused of cold-blooded murder. The jury did not take long to reach a verdict. Brian McManus was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lucille Ann McManus's death shocked the community of Warner Robins. To her family and friends, she was more than the victim of a sham marriage. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman who had worked hard and cared deeply for those around her. Her life ended in brutality, not because of who she was, but because she refused to remain silent. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable questions. How well do we ever really know the people we let into our lives? How far will someone go to protect their lies? This was the disturbing case of Lucille Ann McManus, a woman whose last stand for truth cost her life at the hands of the man she married. Life, inside the prison walls, would be a stark contrast to the freedom Brian had fought so desperately to protect. Once a man who wore a badge and carried authority, he was now reduced to an inmate number, serving out the remainder of his days under constant watch. For those who had once trusted him, the betrayal was difficult to comprehend. A former police officer, a man sworn to uphold justice, had chosen to destroy the very concept of it. In Warner Robins, the shadow of the crime lingered long after the trial ended. Neighbors who once exchanged waves with the McManuses struggled to reconcile the friendly couple they thought they knew with the brutal reality uncovered in court. For many, the house at 202 Wake Forest Drive became a chilling reminder that darkness often hides in plain sight. Lucille's family, meanwhile, carried the heavier burden, the loss of a woman who should have been enjoying her retirement years, surrounded by loved ones. They described her as kind-hearted, grounded, and full of quiet strength. The tragedy of her death lay not just in the violence that ended her life, but in the betrayal that caused it. To be killed by the man she had once promised to share her life with was a cruelty beyond words. Investigators later reflected on the case, noting how quickly Brian's facade unraveled. His attempts to stage a suicide, to manipulate the narrative, and to maintain composure in front of police were calculated but shallow. He underestimated both the forensic science that revealed the truth and the instincts of detectives who immediately sensed something wasn't right. In the end, his experience as a former officer worked against him, exposing his overconfidence and lack of credibility. This case became more than just another line in the records of violent crime. It served as a cautionary tale about deception, desperation, and the lengths some will go to protect a lie. Lucille's death was not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but the product of a long web of manipulation and fraud. When the truth finally threatened to surface, violence became Brian McManus's only solution. And yet, as with all tragedies, there is a lingering lesson. Love, trust, and companionship, the very foundations of marriage, can be twisted into tools for exploitation. When promises are made for selfish gain rather than genuine connection, the end result can be devastating. The story of Lucille Ann McManus reminds us that even in quiet neighborhoods and familiar faces, darkness can reside undetected. It challenges us to look deeper, to question appearances, and to remember that betrayal often comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us. For the prosecutors who handled the case, the conviction brought justice, but not closure. They knew nothing could erase the pain Lucille's family endured, nor undo the years of manipulation she had silently endured at the hands of the man she married. The verdict was a victory for truth, but it was also a sobering reminder that justice often comes only after tragedy. Brian McManus himself became a subject of fascination and disbelief. Here was a man once entrusted with public safety in his home country, now condemned as a killer in the very nation he had fought to remain in. Courtroom observers described his demeanor as cold, detached, as if, even in judgment, he remained more concerned with maintaining control than showing remorse. In the eyes of the jury, that lack of humanity spoke volumes. What struck many about this case was the calculated nature of the crime. This wasn't a sudden act of passion, fueled by anger in the heat of the moment. It was methodical, rehearsed, and deliberate. From the 911 call to the staged suicide story, every detail revealed a man who believed he could outsmart the system. But in trying to cover up his crime, Brian exposed himself more clearly than ever. For the Warner Robins community, the house at 202 Wake Forest Drive became more than just a crime scene. It became a symbol of deception hiding behind suburban walls. Neighbors spoke of how the McManuses seemed quiet, even normal. They kept to themselves. There was nothing outwardly alarming. But behind closed doors, the truth was far darker than anyone could have guessed. It left people asking, how many other secrets are hidden in the homes around us? Lucille's loved ones now face the painful reality of remembering her not for the brutal way her life ended, but for the life she lived. A woman described as resilient, caring, and deeply loyal. She deserved better than betrayal. Friends said she had a warm laugh, a strong sense of right and wrong, and a willingness to help those around her. Those qualities made the betrayal by her husband all the more devastating. In reflecting on this case, criminologists and psychologists point to themes that appear again and again in such tragedies: control, exploitation, and fear of exposure. Brian McManus didn't kill out of love or hate. He killed to preserve a lie. His greatest fear was not losing Lucille, but losing the life he had fraudulently built. And when that foundation was threatened, he chose murder over accountability. This pattern is not unique. Time and again we see cases where the truth becomes dangerous, where lies and deception grow so deep that violence becomes the final desperate attempt to maintain control. Lucille's story is tragic, but it is also a warning. Lies have a way of consuming those who tell them. As the years pass and Brian serves his life sentence, the memory of Lucille Ann McManus remains. Her case will be studied not only as a horrific crime, but as a lesson about the cost of deceit, the danger of exploitation, and the devastating betrayal that can come from those closest to us. Because in the end, this was not just the story of a sham marriage or a failed immigration scheme. It was the story of a woman who trusted, who believed, and who ultimately paid the price for exposing the truth. This was the case of Lucille Ann McManus, a reminder that behind every headline is a human being, a life cut short, and a story that must be told. If this case left you unsettled, there are many more waiting to be told. Don't forget to subscribe and join us as we dive into the hidden truths behind the crimes that haunt communities and shatter lives. Because in every shadow, there's a story. And on this channel, we bring it into the light.